You already know Australia is big. You've seen the maps. You've heard the jokes about the dangerous animals, the endless desert, the sun that wants to kill you. You think you understand what makes Australia, Australia. But here is something that will quietly rearrange the way you see this place. Germany, the entire country of Germany, one of the most densely populated industrial nations on Earth, fits inside Australia roughly 18 times over. And yet Germany holds more than 84 million people. Australia holds just over 26 million. That means if you took every single person living in Australia right now and dropped them into Germany, they wouldn't even fill it halfway. That is not a quirk. That is a geological verdict. And the deeper you go into why Australia is so empty, the more you realize that the real story has almost nothing to do with kangaroos or scorpions. It begins somewhere else, entirely, somewhere older and stranger than anything on the surface would suggest. But first, let me show you just how empty we're really talking about, because the numbers alone are almost impossible to believe. The lower 48 states of the United States and the continent of Australia are roughly the same size. Those 48 states hold more than 300 million people. Australia holds 26 million. To put that another way, the state of California alone, with 39 million people, has more people than the entire Australian continent. Texas, with 28 million, also clears Australia. You could argue, with a straight face, that California is more populous than Australia, and you would be entirely correct. But it gets stranger. England, not the United Kingdom, just England, has a population of more than 57 million people. That is more than double the entire continent of Australia. England fits inside Australia roughly 60 times, and yet England has more than twice the people. Or consider the island of Java, in Indonesia. Java is 6 times smaller than Australia, but Java is home to nearly 150 million people. Almost 6 times Australia's entire population packed onto an island, a fraction of the size. When you stand in central Java, you are surrounded by one of the densest human concentrations on the planet. When you stand in the center of Australia, there is a very real chance you cannot see another human being in any direction for hundreds of kilometers. The Tokyo metropolitan area alone, one city and its suburbs, has more people than the whole of Australia. So do Jakarta and Delhi. The cities of Shanghai, Seoul, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, New York, Cairo, Lagos, and Mumbai all have populations roughly comparable to, or greater than, the entirety of the Australian continent. Australia has 5 actual major cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. Together, they account for the homes of almost 2 out of every 3 Australians. Around 90% of the country's population lives in urban areas that cover just 0.22% of Australia's total land area, and roughly 85% of all Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coastline. This means that behind the thin populated rim of cities and suburbs, there is essentially nothing. And to really feel how nothing that nothing is, consider this. There is a place in Western Australia called the Shire of East Pilbara. It is roughly the same size as Japan, the entire country of Japan, home to 125 million people. The Shire of East Pilbara has just over 10,000 residents. About half of them live in one small town called Newman. You have the landmass of Japan, and you have what amounts to a small country town with a good supermarket. Then look south. In South Australia, there is something called the Pastoral Unincorporated Area. It is roughly the size of France. The entire country of France, 68 million people. The Pastoral Unincorporated Area has a population of around 3,750 people. That works out to approximately 178 square kilometers of land for every single person. One individual, and 178 square kilometers of silent red earth around them in every direction. But the single most surreal fact about Australia's emptiness sits here, Anna Creek Station, a cattle ranch in the South Australian outback. Anna Creek covers roughly 24,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Israel. It is privately owned land, run as a working cattle ranch, and it is operated by around 11 full-time employees, 11 people, and 17,000 cattle on a piece of land bigger than a sovereign nation. And Anna Creek is not even unusual by Australian standards. There are estimated to be close to 100 cattle stations in Australia, larger than the biggest ranch in the United States. So what is it about this continent that produces numbers like these? The easy answer, the desert, the heat, the snakes, is true, but it is only the beginning. The real answer is written in the rock itself, and it goes back further than any civilization, further than any human memory. Start with the mountains. Or rather, start with what Australia doesn't have. Every other major inhabited continent on Earth has at least one dramatic mountain system capable of pulling moisture out of the atmosphere at large scales. The Alps in Europe, the Rockies and Appalachians in North America, the Himalayas in Asia. Mountains force warm, wet air upward. As that air rises, it cools, condenses, and falls as rain. Mountains are rain machines. Australia, almost uniquely among the world's major landmasses, does not have serious mountains. The highest point on the entire Australian mainland is Mount Kosciuszko, at 2,228 meters above sea level. In nearly any other country, that would be a respectable hill. The highest point in every other inhabited continent is more than double that height. And here is the comparison that should genuinely disturb you. About 3/4 of the entire US state of Colorado maintains an elevation significantly higher than Mount Kosciuszko. Not the peaks, the average terrain of Colorado sits higher than Australia's tallest mountain. Australia is a flat continent, geologically exhausted, ancient beyond reckoning. But the mountains it does have create an irony. The Great Dividing Range runs along the entire eastern coast of the continent, north to south, for thousands of kilometers. It is the 5th longest mountain range on Earth, and it acts as a wall. Rain clouds push in from the Pacific, hit the range, drop their moisture on the narrow strip of land between the coast and the mountains, and then drift inland, drained, wrung out, mostly dry. The eastern coastline gets rain. The moment you cross the range heading west, the land dries. The rain shadow cast by those mountains has shaped everything. The human settlements, the agriculture, the story of the entire nation. On the western side of the continent, the problem is different but equally absolute. Cold ocean currents sweep up from Antarctica along Australia's western coast. Cold water means cold air, and cold air does not evaporate enough moisture to build serious rain clouds. The western interior bakes under clear skies, parched by a mechanism that operates thousands of meters below the weather, in the deep cold of the Southern Ocean. And then, splitting the difference, Australia straddles the Tropic of Capricorn. A significant portion of the continent sits within the tropics, and almost all the rest sits in the subtropics. This zone of the planet is dominated by the subtropical high-pressure belt, a permanent feature of Earth's atmospheric system that simultaneously warms and dries the air beneath it. The same pressure belt that turns the Sahara into a desert, that creates the dry zones across northern Mexico and southern Spain, presses down on Australia with continental force. Whatever moisture survives the cold western current, or sneaks past the Great Dividing Range, enters an atmosphere already primed to suppress rainfall. The result, Australia is, by every measurable standard, the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Around 70% of the country is classified as arid or semi-arid. Annual rainfall maps of Australia look almost like a photographic negative of its population maps. Rain falls on the coastal fringes, and people live on the coastal fringes. The interior is the gap between those two facts. But here is where the story gets complicated, because dry does not quite capture it. Dry would be consistent. Dry you could plan around. What Australia's interior faces is something more psychologically devastating. Radical, unpredictable variability. Take Darwin, the largest city on Australia's northern coast. Darwin receives more than 1,800 millimeters of rain per year, nearly 3 times what London gets. By raw numbers, Darwin should be thriving, lush, heavily populated. But almost all of that rain falls in a single 4-month window, during the monsoon wet season. The rest of the year is relentless dry. And across the northern interior beyond Darwin, rainfall follows no pattern at all. In 1898, a tropical cyclone dumped 740 millimeters of rain on a small northern town in a single day, more than London's entire annual average, falling in 24 hours. But in 1924, the same region received just 4 millimeters of rain across the entire year. 4 millimeters. That is less than the yearly average of the Sahara Desert. You cannot build a civilization on rainfall you cannot predict. You cannot plant crops, sink wells, plan irrigation systems, raise children, build towns, on water that might arrive in a catastrophic flood one decade and then vanish entirely the next. This is what the interior of Australia offers, and it is why human settlement has always retreated to the edges. There is one river system on the continent that carries the weight of what Australia needs but cannot reliably get. The Murray-Darling Basin, in the southeast, drains most of the region's agricultural heartland. It provides drinking water for roughly 3 million Australians and supports the farmland that feeds the nation. But even the Murray-Darling is a shadow of what rivers look like on other continents. The basin's average annual flow is about 24,000 gigaliters of water per year. The Mississippi River system in the United States, covering a similar agricultural role, averages close to 530,000 gigaliters per year. That is more than 22 times the flow on a continent of comparable agricultural ambition. The Murray-Darling is the best river system Australia has, and by global standards, it barely qualifies. Climate change is now tightening the pressure further. 9 of the 10 hottest years ever recorded on the Australian continent have occurred since 2005. Higher temperatures accelerate evaporation across the basin's already thin water supply. Sections of the river run completely dry for months at a time. The agricultural heartland that feeds a nation of 26 million is being quietly squeezed by forces that were set in motion long before any of this. By the ancient geology of a continent that lost its mountains millions of years ago. Because that is the deeper layer of the story that almost nobody talks about. Most of the world's best agricultural soils were created relatively recently in geological terms. The glaciers of the last ice age, which ended around 12,000 years ago, ground rock into mineral-rich sediment and deposited it across North America, Europe, and Northern Asia. Those glacial soils are young, in geological terms, and they are fertile. Australia was barely touched by the last glaciation, and more significantly, the northern half of the continent hasn't experienced any mountain building since the Precambrian era, which ended around 540 million years ago. Without mountains eroding, without glaciers grinding, the soil just sat there, weathering, leaching, losing its nutrients to rain and wind across hundreds of millions of years. The soils of northern Australia have been exposed to erosion for over 250 million years, compared to less than 10,000 years for most of the soils of Europe or North America. The result is soil that is, on average, among the poorest in the world for large-scale agriculture. Ancient, exhausted, mineral-depleted. The continent's geology is not just old. It is old in a way that has direct, measurable consequences for how many people it can feed. And yet, and this is where the story doubles back on itself, Australia is not simply too poor and too dry to support more people. That is the conventional answer. But the actual arithmetic doesn't support it. Australia has an estimated 492 cubic kilometers of renewable freshwater resources. That is twice as much as Pakistan, a country with more than 8 times Australia's population. In terms of arable land, only about 6% of Australia's territory is genuinely suitable for farming. But 6% of a continent is still an enormous amount of land. Australia has more arable land than Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos combined. Those countries together hold more than 540 million people. Australia holds 26 million and has more usable farmland than all of them. By the ratio of arable land per citizen, Australia is in a category entirely its own. The figure sits at roughly 1.9 arable hectares per person. In the United States, the same ratio is about 0.47 hectares per person. If Australia ever reached the same population to farmland ratio as the United States, the continent would be home to over 90 million people. If it reached Germany's ratio, the number would be higher still. So the land, technically, could hold more. The water technically could support more. The resources are there, at least on paper, which means the real question is not geological. It is historical. Why did so few people ever arrive? The answer begins in isolation. So complete it is almost incomprehensible. For tens of millions of years, Australia has been drifting alone, a lost continent cut off from every major landmass by open ocean. No land bridges, no island chains close enough to encourage easy crossing, just water enormous in different expanses of it. The continent's isolation is ancient enough that it shaped its biology in entirely separate directions from the rest of the world. Australia is the only continent where marsupials, not placental mammals, dominate the indigenous wildlife. This happened because nothing from outside could easily get in, and nothing from inside could easily get out. Modern humans first reached Australia around 50,000 years ago, when sea levels were dramatically lower, and a land bridge called Sahul connected Australia to New Guinea. Those first arrivals, the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians, were among the earliest long-distance seafarers in human history. They crossed open water and walked into a continent no person had ever set foot on. And then, as the last ice age ended and sea levels rose around 10,000 years ago, the land bridge flooded. Australia was cut off again. For the next roughly 9,600 years, the continent remained almost entirely unknown to the rest of humanity. The Aboriginal population may have stabilized at around 650,000 to 700,000 people, the sustainable limit of what the land, managed by centuries of accumulated knowledge, could support. When Dutch sailors accidentally blundered into the western coast of Australia in the early 1600s, they found a coastline that offered almost nothing commercially attractive: no spices, no obvious gold, no fertile river valleys, no sheltered harbors teeming with trade goods. The Dutch noted the continent's existence, mapped pieces of it, and largely moved on. The most dramatic Dutch encounter with Australia came not from curiosity, but from catastrophe. In 1656, a ship called the Vergolde Drake wrecked off the Western Australian coast. 75 survivors made it ashore. 7 of them set out in a lifeboat on a 1,400-kilometer open ocean journey to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, to raise the alarm. After 41 days at sea, those 7 arrived and reported the disaster. Search missions were sent. The wreck was never found. The 68 survivors left behind on the Australian coast were never seen again. They vanished into the void of a continent the world had not yet decided how to approach. It was not until 1963, more than 3 centuries later, that divers finally located what remained of the Vergulda Drek on the seabed, roughly 100 kilometers north of Perth. Britain's permanent settlement of Australia began in 1788, on the opposite side of the continent, around modern-day Sydney, with approximately 1,300 people. For context, at that moment in history, Asia already held more than 650 million people. Europe held close to 150 million. Africa, around 85 million. The Americas, roughly 20 million. Australia began the modern era of development with a population base so far behind every other inhabited continent that the gap has never fully closed. By 1788, the newly independent United States had a population of about 4 million. Australia would not surpass that 1788 American population figure until the year 1906, more than a century of history later. And by 1906, the United States was already approaching 90 million people. Immigration could have accelerated the gap closing, and in one spectacular brief moment, it did. The discovery of gold on the continent in 1851 triggered a gold rush that brought extraordinary numbers of migrants, primarily from the British Isles, but also from China, from the Americas, from across Europe, and effectively doubled Australia's population within a decade. It was the fastest demographic surge the continent had ever seen. It should have been the beginning of a sustained wave of migration. But then something happened that would shape Australia's population story for the next century. In 1901, the newly federated Australian government enacted the Immigration Restriction Act, what would become known as the White Australia Policy. Only migrants of European descent were permitted. Initially, the policy gave strong preference to migrants from Britain specifically. The effect was immediate and lasting. The flow of immigrants slowed to a trickle. While the United States received millions of new arrivals every few years, Australia received a fraction of that number. Carefully selected, heavily restricted. The First World War made things worse. Almost 1 in 5 Australian men were shipped to the trenches and beaches of Europe. Around 2.5% of Australia's total male population never came home. A continent that could not afford to lose people lost them by the hundreds of thousands. By the eve of the Second World War, Australia was a small, overwhelmingly European nation of just 7 million people, sitting on the periphery of Asia. And then, the geography of its position became terrifyingly clear. Imperial Japan had a population of more than 73 million, more than 10 times Australia's. When Japanese forces bombed Darwin in 1942, the fear that swept the continent was not abstract or theoretical. It was the fear of a small population staring across a narrow stretch of ocean at a much larger one, separated only by water and luck. The invasion never came, but the lesson was absorbed deeply. Australia needed more people. For the first time after the war, immigration policy began to open cautiously, incrementally to mainland Europeans. Displaced refugees from Poland, the Baltic states, Italy, the Balkans, and Greece arrived in numbers Australia had rarely seen before. By the 1960s, roughly 3 million mainland Europeans had resettled on the continent, reshaping its culture in ways still visible today. But the exclusion of non-European migrants remained almost entirely in force until 1973, when the White Australia policy was finally, formally dismantled. For 72 years, Australia had been turning away the majority of the world's population from its shores, not for geographic reasons, not for resource reasons, but for ideological ones. The consequence of those 72 years was a population far smaller than the land might otherwise have supported. Since 1973, Australia has moved in the opposite direction with remarkable speed. Multiculturalism became official policy. Immigration from Asia, particularly China and India, has become the dominant source of new arrivals. As of recent years, close to 1 in 3 people living in Australia was born outside of it. By that measure, Australia has the highest proportion of foreign-born residents of any major developed Western nation, higher than the United States, higher than Germany, higher than Canada. Australia today accepts fewer than 200,000 new immigrants per year, a figure that sounds modest but represents one of the highest immigration rates relative to existing population of any developed country on Earth. And by 2050, projections suggest the continent's population will reach around 36 million roughly, where Canada sits today. But every one of those future residents will live on a continent that has not changed its fundamental geometry. The rain shadow still falls. The subtropical high-pressure belt still suppresses rainfall across the interior. The Murray-Darling Basin still runs on ancient water that is becoming harder to replenish. The soils of the north are still thin, ancient, exhausted, and the temperatures are rising. 9 of the 10 hottest years in Australia's recorded history have fallen since 2005. The droughts are longer. The rivers that do run thinner. The bushfires, which have always been part of the Australian landscape, burn larger and hotter, particularly during El Niño cycles. When the Pacific winds slow, moisture delivery to the eastern and northern coast drops, and the interior bakes under conditions that make fire almost inevitable. The continent is being asked to support more people precisely as the geographic forces that have always limited it are intensifying. And here is the thought that stays with you after all of this. Australia today is the world's second largest producer of sheep and wool, with more than 104 million sheep on the continent, 4 times the human population. It is the 5th largest producer of beef. It is a global leader in organic farmland certification, holding slightly more than half of all certified organic farmland on the planet. It exports food to hundreds of millions of people across Asia. It is, by almost any agricultural measure, punching far above its demographic weight. The continent that geography cursed with flat terrain, ancient soils, unreliable rainfall, and continental isolation has managed to feed itself and much of the world beyond it, with 26 million people and a landmass the size of the contiguous United States. But consider what that means in reverse. If you drive across Western Australia from Esperance on the south coast to Carnarvon near the north coast, it takes at least 35 hours. You cross more than 3,200 kilometers along that entire route, through the full width of a continent. The total population of every town you pass through combined is less than 70,000 people. For comparison, that is roughly the same distance and the same driving time as crossing from Madrid to Istanbul from one edge of Europe to the other. That route passes through dozens of countries and hundreds of cities, tens of millions of people. Australia's 3,200 kilometers yields fewer people than a medium-sized university town. This is what geology and location and history have constructed: a continent-sized space, ancient beyond reckoning, geographically beautiful and geographically brutal, capable of feeding multitudes, but long resistant to holding them. A place that the earth itself seems to have designed for solitude. The question is not whether more people will eventually fill it. They will, gradually, driven by climate displacement, by economic need, by the mathematics of population growth elsewhere. The question is whether the water that makes that possible, the same water that geography has always rationed so carefully, will hold. That is the bet Australia is making. That the land's capacity, if managed wisely enough, will outrun the tightening of the climate. That the continent, which took 200 years to reach 26 million, can find a sustainable path to 36 million and beyond without breaking the ancient, fragile systems that make any of it possible at all. Geography set the terms. Humanity is still negotiating them.